Well,
Well, Alan, you were totally muted. I didn't hear a thing you said. Say it again, please.
yes. Okay. So here we go again.
Okay.
Welcome to the Alen Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Lillian Faderman. Lillian is an international known scholar of lesbian history and literature. She's the author of 11 books, and today we will speak about her latest book, Woman, The American History of an Idea. Lillian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I must say Happy Women's History Month, Lillian.
Thank you.
um,
And
I,
same to you, since everyone should be celebrating it.
Yes, I went to your bio page. You have written so many books. You have so much history behind you. I wonder if we could start with you telling us a little bit about your background. I know that you have been a professor and also an author, and you have joined the lesbian cause. You have informed us about the history of lesbians. So there are so many things that I'm eager to know. Can you start anywhere and then we pick it up from there?
I got my PhD in 1967 from UCLA. And what I wanted to write about in my dissertation was just, it was not doable in the 1960s. I wanted to write about the history of women. I wanted to write about lesbian and gay history. And there was no way that would have been permissible in 1965, 1966, when I started my dissertation.
Why you couldn't write about the history of women in the 60s?
Because it was not considered a legitimate topic yet in the 1960s. There was a little bit of scholarly work that was being done, but I would have been discouraged from doing it at UCLA. And as far as writing about lesbians were concerned, UCLA in the 1960s was still a pretty homophobic place. There's no way that one could have come out and gotten a degree and gone into the teaching profession. I was actually an undergraduate at UCLA in 1958. And when I entered, all of the freshmen had to take a series of tests. They were psychological tests along with other kinds of tests, but repeatedly there was a question that said something like, are you attracted to members of the same sex? Have you ever kissed someone of the same sex? And it was just, repeated in various ways in various language. And of course, I knew to say no to everything there. And I discovered when I was doing research for my book, Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers, that just a few years earlier, in 1954, the man who was the dean of students, together with the associate dean of students, wrote an article for a journal for professionals called School and Society. And the whole point of the article was that it was the obligation of deans of students to ferret out the homosexuals, as the term was then, and make sure that that student, the homosexual student, either go for treatment, which meant, of course, some form of conversion, or be dismissed from campus lest that student infect others with his or her homosexuality. So it was very dangerous in the 1960s. In the 1970s, though, there was an active gay movement, there was an active lesbian feminist movement, and it hadn't quite yet gotten to my campus, but I had tenure. And I was sure that if I wrote about lesbian history, I would not be in trouble, because I couldn't imagine my department or the whole university making an issue over a subject that I chose, a tenured professor, would have been my academic freedom to write about lesbian history. And so I did. I published a number of articles in the 1970s. And finally, that became my first research book. It was called Surpassing the Love of Men, Romantic Friendship and Love Between Women from the Renaissance to the Present. It was a very ambitious project, and that came out in 1981. And that sort of set the course of my research in subsequent years. I did another book about 20th century lesbian life called Odd Girls and Twilight Lovers in 1991. Another book called To Believe in Women, which looked at late 19th century, early 20th century women who were active in the suffrage movement, who were really responsible for American women getting the vote. They were active in opening colleges to women in America. They were active in opening the professions to American women. And that was my concern in the book To Believe in Women that came out in 1999. And then I became interested in gay history as well. And so with a gay male scholar, I did a book called Gay LA, which was a history of gay people and lesbian people and trans people in Los Angeles from before Los Angeles became, before California became a state, I should say, all the way to the present, and that came out in 2006. And then I did a book that was a history of the gay and lesbian and trans and bisexual revolution called the Gay Revolution. And I use the term gay, as I explained, because that once used to be an umbrella term for all of us. That came out in 2015. And then most recently, before my present book, I did a biography of Harvey Milk, who of course was our gay martyr who was assassinated in San Francisco. He was really victimized by a fellow Board of Supervisors member who was very homophobic. And one of the reasons Harvey Milk was assassinated was because of Dan White's homophobia. And then I wanted to explore, and I think all of my books really stemmed from things I wanted to find out more about, things that hadn't been written about before and that seemed to me personally important to explore, but hopefully important to other people as well. And so the way I came to the latest book, Woman, the American History of an Idea, as I explain at the beginning of the book, I grew up in a working class neighborhood in East Los Angeles in the 1950s. And there was no way that we fit the typical stereotype of what women were supposed to be like in the 1950s. Most of my classmates were Mexican Americans. In junior high school, girls were often what was called pachucas, gang girls who were very often in trouble with the law. I would have been in trouble with the law too, because I had already discovered my outlaw sexuality as a lesbian. And despite the fact that we were so different from the Ozzie and Harriet image or the June Cleaver image, this is what was inculcated in us. And of course, we resisted it. We had to resist it for the sake of our personal sanity. But that was what we were told was the way women were supposed to be. And so I became fascinated by trying to figure out why we were told that that was the image of women that we were supposed to conform to. How did that start, and when did it start? And how was it eventually possible for me to even get a doctorate? Pardon me. How was it possible for me to fight against that image by the late 1950s when that was so pervasive? Who were the pioneers that made questioning that image, challenging that image possible. So anyway, as often happens with my research books, I thought I would look back a few decades, and as it happened, I looked at the 19th century and the 18th century and the 17th century, and I even talked about Native Americans and their view of woman before the Europeans invaded this continent.
Well, before we go into the topic of the book, I wonder if you could tell us. So you discovered your sexual orientation on the 50s. I gather. How do you deal with that psychologically? Do you feel that you were a stranger in this world, or you felt comfortable with your sexuality at that time and thought that everybody else was wrong to criticize
Well,
your
we
life?
were there was no way to feel that everyone else was wrong on a more global level, because the pervasive notion was that homosexuals were outlaws. I think I really had an outlaw identity as a teenager. I discovered other gay girls, as we were called in the 1950s, by I had a gay friend, a boy, who gave me a phony ID. He was a minor as well. You weren't supposed to go to bars if you were a teenager. You couldn't drink until you were 21. But he took me to a gay girls' bar. And there I found a society. There I found other young gay women, and I realized I was not alone, that we were legion, although it was never talked about, except for these terrible pulp novels in which the character had to either commit suicide at the end or convert to heterosexuality or drown in a well of loneliness, as it were. It could never end happily. The terrible end of the character in the pulp novel was called A Redeeming Social Purpose. And those novels could be published only if they had some kind of redeeming social message at the end, and that was that the homosexual ended badly. So they were very difficult times, and much of my research has been concerned with finding out historically why those were such difficult times.
And just one more question in this aspect. How was your relationship with your parents? Were they acceptance of your personality, or did they push back, or how did that work out?
My mother was a single mother. She did not marry the man who was my father. He was not in my life. My mother was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, from Latvia. I once told her and my aunt, with whom I was very close, that I was a homosexual. I had to explain what that meant. I was still a teenager. And my aunt said, and I said, that means I love women. And my aunt said, don't be silly, there's no such thing. And she just went on to the next subject. So I guess, as far as my family was concerned, I probably had it easy. I knew they weren't going to disown me. I knew that my mother and aunt loved me, and ignorance was bliss in that case. They really didn't believe in the possibility of a woman loving another woman.
Okay, well, I'm glad I had it work out like that, because I have interviewed other people, and that was one of the most painful things that they had to go through their life when they come out and they had to face their family, and sometimes their family disown them.
Yes, which was very common in the 1950s and 60s and even later, and surely it's still common in some communities.
Okay, so now reading your book, you take us back all the way to the 17th century. And as I'm reading the book, I'm horrified by the level of submission that men expected out of women. They were just properties. And anyway, I wonder if you could just paint the picture of the kind of life a woman was living at that time.
I should say too that it's true that they were property. It's true that they had to submit. The laws were usually femme couvert laws, which meant that when a woman married, she was a non-entity. If she came into the marriage with her own property, the property belonged to her husband. She did not have jurisdiction over her own children. She had virtually no freedom of expression of any kind. There were women who rebelled, as I talk about, and when they rebelled, they were in great trouble. They were banished, as Anne Hutchinson was, for instance, who was this wonderful woman who tried to preach in the 17th century, or they were thrown in jail, or a cleft stick was put around their tongue so they couldn't talk, or they were put in the stocks. Or beginning in the 1740s, they were hanged as witches. And of course, in the 1640s, and in 1692, there was a absolute witch hysteria in Salem, Massachusetts, where many women in particular were arrested. There were a few men who were arrested, but primarily women, and many of them were imprisoned and hanged. And it was fascinating to me to find out how the Europeans, primarily the English, dealt with the population who was already here, the Native Americans, people that they identified as Indians, they called Native Americans. In many Indian tribes, as I discovered, women were very strong. They were often in control of agriculture and food distribution. They got to say what was planted and who ate virtually. In many tribes, there were councils of wise women who advised the men. In many tribes, they could be the ones to decide whether there should be a war. They were often the ones to decide whether to ask for peace if they were conquered by another tribe or overcome by another tribe. And I have an interesting story in my book in that regard. And that is that at one point in the 17th century, the English settlers had virtually massacred many, many people in a Pequot village in Connecticut. And the Pequot Indians realized that they couldn't keep going. Something like 600 men, women, and children were killed. And so they wanted to sue for peace. And they did what they usually did when there was a war between Indian tribes. They sent the woman to the English, a council of Englishmen, to say, we surrender, we want peace. And according to Roger Williams, who was a leader during colonial times, he wrote to the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop. He tells the story. He says, they sent a woman to us and we questioned her much and sent her back because after all, she was a woman. And then they sent another woman and he says, we questioned her for her truth and sent her back. And then they sent 5 people to the British colonists to beg for peace, 4 women and an old man. And Roger said, and we were willing to discuss peace with the old man. That is, the 4 women who came were simply superfluous. Wow. So I think the colonists did not know what to make of this, these societies that they saw around them, where women had much more power, where gender and sexuality were nothing like attitudes towards gender and sexuality, I should say, were nothing like attitudes towards gender and sexuality as far as the colonists were concerned.
Wow. Well, your book takes us into the 19th century, then take us to the Depression, World War II. And approaching our era, we are in a time period in which we have more women entering and graduating from college than men. And it seems like some of us men are having a hard time dealing with that. I wonder if you could comment about that new paradigm.
Yes, and that's been the case since the 1970s. In fact, there have been more women not only college graduates, but college students. Women have outnumbered men. And eventually, in the 70s, there was very little representation of women in professional schools, for instance, and medical schools and law schools and business schools. And eventually it came to reach almost parity. And I think it has reached parity in our era. I think that gender and sexuality are really in an interesting upheaval now. And I'm loath to predict how it's going to turn out, but I think part of the upheaval is not only that women outnumber men in colleges, but it's also that the trans community and the non-binary community has really called into question the fact that there are simply men and women from birth, and that's the way it is, and there's no fluidity, there's no flexibility, there's no questioning. Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s invented something that he called the Kinsey scale that dealt with sexuality. It went from 0 to 6. And 0 was someone who was completely heterosexual, and 6 was someone who was completely homosexual. What he discovered, though, is that, yes, of course, there were some 0s and there were some 6s, but there was also some 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s. And I think it's useful to think of gender that way too. I think in the 17th century, where our discussion began, it would have been inconceivable to say that someone who was assigned male at birth wasn't male for his entire life, and that's the way it had to be, and he never questioned it. And that was true of someone who was assigned female at birth. She would never question that she was woman for her entire life. It was so interesting to me in 2019 that Merriam-Webster Dictionary every year selects a word of the year. In 2019, the word of the year was they, meaning someone who was non-binary, someone who didn't want to be described in terms of he or she. And the term non-binary, in fact, was the runner-up word of the year for dictionary.com. And so it's become so common. 35% of young people in Gen Z, are now saying that either they or their friends do not want to be described by the pronouns he or she. 35%. And it means that there's a real revolution in the way we think about gender. I think that biology is no longer destiny. I think we're rethinking the whole concept of biology when it comes to gender. I think we understand now that there isn't simply man and woman. And I think we understand that many people can choose to identify in between, and many people feel that whatever they were identified as at birth in terms of gender, that is boy or girl, that could be an error, that is that one sex doesn't always have to do with one's gender. And that's where I end the book virtually, that the whole question of gender has become so much more sophisticated than it was where I began the book, or even in the 20th century, which is not to say that there weren't always non-binary people and that there weren't always trans people. Of course they were, but they didn't have that terminology in other eras. And so, for instance, I tell one very sad story I discovered of a sailor in the 17th century who was discovered to be, as we would say today, the person identified as male and became a sailor on a ship, obviously with all men, but as we would say today, was assigned female at birth, presented, this person assigned female at birth presented himself, we would say, as a man. Once the other sailors discovered that this was a person assigned female at birth, that is with female genitalia, they, as they would have said, they made her, they would have said, run the gauntlet. That is, they made her run between lines of whips, the other sailors lined up with really disgusting stuff. And then the person was tarred and feathered. Truly disgusting.
Wow.
But anyway, my point is that, if that person had lived today, there would be no question, I think, that the person would identify as a trans man. But in the 17th century, the category virtually didn't exist for other people.
Wow.
And there are many stories like that that I tell in the book.
Well, since the 17th century to our days, there have been certainly a lot of progress in the status of women, but I wonder if there is a backlash nowadays. For example, a few days ago, the president of South Korea won the election on an anti-feminist slogan. And not to go too far away, I mean, we have Donald Trump, who didn't care so much about the rights of women either. So I want, and I am sad to say this, but I have a friend or an ex-friend who was totally against the Me Too movements and the right of women, and I it's something that I couldn't understand. But I wonder if that's a backlash of some of us men who are insecure with this rising equality of our days.
Yes, there have always been backlashes against the progress that women have made. In the 1930s, there was an excuse for the backlash, that is, women were beginning to enter the workforce in great numbers in the early 20th century. During World War I, they occupied positions that women had never occupied before. They were going to college in really significant numbers. And then the Depression happened, and people were saying it was men who needed the jobs because men had families to support and women were sent back to the home. In the 1940s, during the war, during World War II, women were begged to enter the workforce today. Again, it was sort of like a seesaw. In the 30s, they were sent home. In the 40s, they were begged to enter the workforce to work on behalf of victory over our enemies. Huge numbers of women were working again. The war was over. The men came home from the war. Again, they were sent home. And that was where I came in the 1950s, where the image that I knew of woman growing up as an adolescent, a child, an adolescent, a teenager, was, as I explained earlier, June Cleaver or Harriet from Ozzie and Harriet. That is the happy housewife wearing an apron all the time with a big smile. And it's been very interesting to me about these backlashes. In the 1980s, women had been in the workforce for more than a decade in great numbers. And suddenly there was not only a backlash from the outside, but an internal backlash. Women were going home again. And newspapers, like the New York Times, for instance, that I quote, had headlines throughout the 80s, like "professional women do go home again," as though it was a good thing for women who trained to be doctors and lawyers as they finally could again, to give it all up, to become happy housewives once more. Or another headline that I quote about how many women now say they prefer family over a career. Headlines like that throughout the 1980s. And the reason I think that was happening is that, as another scholar, Arlie Hochschild, said in a very interesting book that came out in 1989 called The Second Shift, is that women had progressed in the 1980s, but men hadn't. And so women came home and they did a second shift. That is, they had to clean the house and they had to go shopping for dinner, and then they had to fix dinner, and then they had to wash up after dinner, and they had responsibility for making sure the kids got to bed. And as Harley Hochschild said, and she interviewed many couples about the problem of the second shift, men's responsibility was taking care of the car and walking the dog, and that was it.
Wow.
And so I think for many women, it simply became too much. They hadn't figured out how to get their partners, if they were heterosexual, to take responsibility around the house. I've discovered, though, that things are getting better. And I say discovered just by looking at recent polls and attitudes towards gender. There was a Pew Research poll that was taken about 2 years ago, and only a quarter of the men interviewed said that they see themselves as very masculine, and only a fifth of the women interviewed say they see themselves as very feminine. And what that means is that jobs around the house no longer have to be as stereotypical as they were even in the 1980s. So I think progress is being made in that direction as well.
Okay, and just to close this interview, what do you see as the future for women in our society? And of course, that's also dependent on which country we're talking about. Let's say United States and Canada.
I look only at the United States. I know that the situation in Canada is often similar to what it is in the United States. I don't think I would dare speculate about other countries, but that's what I do in the epilogue. I really wonder if we've gone too far in the evolution of the concept of woman to ever go back. But we don't know. We don't know, because one would have thought we had gone so far, even in the early 20th century, with the advent of the new woman who was going to college and going into the professions and demanding her own sexuality, whatever that meant to her. Who would have thought there would have been such a backlash against that? And yet there was. So I would like to think that we've gone too far to return to these older, more constrictive notions of who woman is, but I don't know, and I end up speculating on both sides.
I will have to interview you in another 10 years to see what happened.
Terrific.
There, Lillian, I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
Yes, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question. The title of the book.
Yes, and where can people follow you?
Oh, yes. The title of the book is Woman, the American History of an Idea. And I do have a web page, and I'm on Facebook, and I'm sometimes on Twitter.
Lillian, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alan. I enjoyed it.